Life Unfiltered podcast. I'm your host, Kim McWatt, and today we'll be talking about the issue of high copper in engine oil with our guest, Matt Quick, Director of Business Development. Hey, Matt.
Hi, Kim. How are you?
I'm not too bad. So, copper is a tricky element to properly diagnose based on routine oil analysis alone. High copper is often interpreted as normal signs of copper leaching, but the results could be hiding something much more insidious. Have you encountered this problem before?
Yeah, absolutely. When we're talking especially about a lot of engine applications, we see a great deal of copper leaching in the industry. But then of course the question becomes, what is copper leaching? Because you need to kind of understand the chemistry and then what's happening, and then of course I'd be able to identify is is copper leaching a problem? Is this copper that I'm seeing a problem? Where could it be coming from? And just so then that opens up the door of how do we do this with routine analysis and with different oil analysis approaches. Yeah, absolutely.
So when it comes to copper leaching, what are usually the sources of copper leaching?
Right. Well, great question. One that we get a lot, actually. And so typically copper leaching happens to new components. So like new engines. It's when effectively, in essence, it's when the ZDDP additive, so the anti-wear additive in the oil, interacts with the surface or copper surfaces, typically on coolers. And that causes the surface, it kind of somewhat erodes and dissolves the surface of those components, and it brings that element into suspension in the oil. So it dissolves it and it brings in this copper, so that you start to see these really high, really elevated levels of copper in normal conditions. And sometimes, yeah, the copper can be in the hundreds, 500, 600 part per million. And that would be when we detect it using the ICP in a routine analysis sample.
So aside from the copper leaching then, because you mentioned that it could be a really high source of copper, and so you could think, oh my God, there's something wrong. But is that kind of copper leaching often hiding something else? Could there be other sources of copper and lead in the engine oil?
Yeah, absolutely. There's a few different places that copper will traditionally come from. And of course, it'll come from bushings, which are soft components that are designed to wear. And when you see copper from those components or those pieces, it's assumed, or it's interpreted as normal wear, because that is a part designed to wear, so it protects other components. And so that there's nothing wrong with that. That is it behaving exactly as it should. But you also, of course, see copper from bearings. Copper is a very common piece of the metallurgy in most bearings, and so yeah, that's when you see copper generated from bearings. That is what we would consider to be abnormal copper wear.
Okay. Okay, so what kind of tests would Fluid Life use to detect wear metals like copper in oil?
Traditionally, the copper is going to be detected through the ICP, and that's something that is part of a routine analysis program. It's a test that's performed on every single sample. The way that test works, of course, is that some of the sample is sucked up and it's shot into a nebulizer. It's basically misted into a flame that then excites all the particles. Not going to get into all the details, but so that is one way of measuring the copper. Now, part of the problem or the limitations with that test, one is going to be size, because the particles themselves have to make it to the flame to be counted. Particles that are over about 10 microns in size tend to drop out, or have the ability to drop out and not make it. And therefore, the larger the particles get, the less likely that they are going to be accurately counted through traditional oil analysis. And that's why, that's why there's all the big push for large particle assessment in a lot of these applications, or different and triggered analysis. So ICP is going to be one way. Another way that you can detect copper is going to be through X-ray analysis. And the X-ray doesn't have the same size limitations as the ICP does, because it's going to capture everything. But there's a couple of different X-ray methods. If you're X-raying a oil, like a liquid matrix, then what happens is you get a fully quantitative method. It's very accurate, just like the ICP. But one of the limitations of that is going to be, again, you don't know how that copper is, like where it came from. You don't know how it's bonded. Is it copper bonded to lead, in which case, hey, you know what? This is bearing material. Or is this copper bonded to
Right.
copper, in which case it could be bushing, hey, totally normal. Or is it copper on its own, which could be indicative of leaching? And so
Mm.
knowing how that copper was positioned, how it like its metallurgy, how it's bonded together with other elements gives you the indication you need of where it came from. When you're doing the X-ray as well, if you're trying to X-ray something like cake debris, spinners, filter back flushing, and patches, the X-ray then is not a fully quantitative method. It's what's referred to as a semi-quant method. That all that implies is that it's not specifically, when it gives you a result, that result's actually not specifically representative of the part per million values. It's more indicative of the ratios of what is being seen on the patch. And so there's other methods, of course, and instruments available that can give you a little bit more detail, both around the metal composition in terms of how it was bonded and where it came from, and more accurate, specific particle counting.
Okay.
And that's going to be through things like the scanning electron microscope, which we can probably talk about a little bit later.
Okay. So of those, like, in your opinion, is one test better than another test, or are they both have their, pros and cons?
Yeah, absolutely. Every test has its value, and every test has things that are going to be fantastic, and there's reasons why we do that. And of course, there's going to be some limitations or drawbacks. So when it comes to the ICP, one of the pros there, of course, is that it is inexpensive. It's performed on every single sample that you pretty much ever put through a laboratory as part of the routine analysis. So speed and accuracy and cost are going to be some huge
Right.
pluses for running ICP analysis. And with the size kind of limitations maybe is being it's not a con as long as we understand it and we account for it. But
Right.
it's one of the limitations of the instrument and of the method. So another we can, and then of course the fact that it has to destroy the sample and doesn't get the metallurgy, doesn't get how those elements were bonded together, in the same way that if it's measuring additives, like zinc bonded to phosphorus, it can't tell you if that ZDDP additive is still active or if it's been broken apart and used. It still just measures that the presence of the additive, but not whether or not it's active. So
Okay.
ICP is fantastic, but it does have certain limitations.
Okay.
In the same way, the X-ray, we're going to get a little bit more into, of course, cost being one of the drawback there. The X-ray is going to be a little bit more expensive. Rather than doing it all the time, you're probably going to look to trigger it. The fact that when you get into patch methods and stuff, that it becomes a semi-quant is probably a little bit of a drawback, because when people see those results, they want to interpret them as ppm and direct link back to ICP values and stuff, but that's just not exactly how it works.
Okay.
And unless you're doing that, if you're doing an X-ray on an oil, then you still can't account for the leaching. So the X-ray is not going to really necessarily help you if you're X-raying the oil. If you X-ray a patch, it can help you determine whether or not the source was leaching. But and then of course, and then there's analytical ferrography, which we didn't mention the first time around. But some of the limitations there is that ferrography is when they take some of the oil and they put it onto a slide that has a magnet underneath it, and it lines up all the ferrous particles. And so you can identify copper by the fact that it doesn't line up nicely with the rest of the magnetic debris. And then, of course, it's heat treated so that you can see, hey, is this copper or not? Part of the problem there, again, is going to be cost, the turnaround time to do ferrographies, and then the subjective nature of a ferrography.
Okay.
When you have a technician looking at something under a microscope, everybody might interpret it a little bit differently. Hey, is this a 5 or an 8 in terms of its severity? But it's a very valuable test, of course. But again, it does have its limitations in terms of trendability. And you tend to focus on when you're doing something like a ferrography and you're looking at a sample or a patch or whatever it is or a slide under a microscope, you tend to key in on just a couple of the really big particles that you're seeing. And so it's a fairly focused analysis, pretty like a limited view, as it were. You're not going to capture all of the the range of particles. You're really going to be focused on just a couple. So that's that's some of the, I guess, the good and the bad with something like a
Like the
ferrography.
traditional ones. Okay.
Yeah, yeah.
So you mentioned SEM particle analysis. Um, why would that one be used in addition to an ICP or instead of an ICP? What would be some of the uses for an SEM analysis?
Yeah, so the way that the SEM works, because it's not, it doesn't have to destroy the sample or anything. It can see how the elements are bonded together. So it can look at a large particle, and first it has no size restrictions whatsoever. So it's going to see everything. And then instead of focusing on just a few particles, you can actually it can analyze the entire view, the entire patchwork, to determine the composition and sizing of every single particle that's there. So that makes it a very valuable test from like a trendability standpoint, because you get the actual counts of the particles. You have this much copper and this much copper bonded to lead, this much iron and iron oxides and different things. So it's really able to determine the composition of every particle that it's analyzing. So that's one of the very, very big benefits to doing an SEM.
Right. So basically, if you're seeing a lot of high copper, you could be assuming that it is copper leaching. But then if it triggers a SEM, you could actually then dive deeper and find out what's going on.
Absolutely. Yeah. When we did a bit of a study where we determined that in the cases of copper leaching,
Mm-hmm.
1/3 of the instances where we were seeing leached copper, there was also the presence of abnormal bearing wear. So, of course, that was varying degrees. Just because there's a little bit of abnormal bearing wear, or I guess, and any bearing wear is typically considered abnormal. But just because there's the presence doesn't mean that it's masking a failure. But there are many instances where it is masking a failure. You have one of the, when you have copper leaching, one of the most common periods that we said that it happens is right at the beginning of a component's life. So right when you put an engine into service, that's also, infant mortality. That's also one of the times that your component is most exposed. Just because the manufacturing process and getting it implemented and installed and firing it up. And so you have this, you suffer from the infant mortality failure rates. And so that's one of those times that you really do kind of want to know, especially if you have an asset that's on warranty. You want to know, hey, rather than just brushing it off, because every time you see it, you're like, oh, you know what, that's copper leaching. That's high copper in a new asset. We just put that engine in, it's copper leaching. But it's not always just copper leaching.
Right.
So when you're past the copper leaching phase, where hundreds of ppm of copper is normal, and you move to a normal machine wear pattern where maybe 30, 40, 50 ppm is significant. When you blend those kind of two time frames together, hundreds can easily mask 30, 40, 50 ppm of wear copper. And so really being able to identify hey, is this a problem? Is there some abnormal wear going on? And being able to watch that, because of course you are going to have some wear that takes place when you put a machine into service as well.
Right.
And that's to be expected. And you just want to make sure that that the levels are as expected, that they're not too much, and that you can kind of watch that get back to normal, instead of whether or not it's going to elevate or get worse.
Okay. So these are all really interesting findings. How would you put these kinds of concepts into action in your own, in like one of our customers' oil analysis programs?
Yeah, absolutely. Great question. What we've recommended, we have some customers that are doing now. There's a few different ways that you can really go about it, but one of those is going to be picking it. You can actually pick a trigger point, based on copper values, where you see in the ICP, because that's going to be your first indicator. And there's going to be a level at which you say, you know what, when it gets beyond this, we have some leaching, but is it just leaching? And so you can then say, hey, you know what, when I reach pick a number, 50 ppm copper, 20 ppm copper, I want to trigger an additional analysis to be able to
Mhm.
determine, is this leaching or not? And sometimes, people, customers typically, it's funny because they want they want almost there to be a problem, because like you do
Mhm.
say you trigger a test, because one of the, of course, the SEM is not an inexpensive test, and that's why we don't do it every time, or else we would. It has come down significantly, years and years ago. SEM's been around for a long time, but it was typically only used for mission critical applications, for research. It costs
Failure
thousands of
analysis. Yeah.
dollars and many, many man hours with this, with the microscope, with this massive microscope, that where they're analyzing one particle at a time, and then generating a report. Those days, now we've moved far beyond that. And so now we're in a place where, with the use of automated software systems, with the scaling down of the instruments, it's much more approachable for industry. And so industry can adopt these things now at a much more prevalent rate. And so when you can trigger these, based on copper values. You can also, institute things like SEM, because if you have, something on your machine like a spinner filter, then, which we see a lot, of course, people want to remove the wear, they want to keep the machine healthy, they want to extend oil drains. So if you have something like a centrifugal filter on an engine, it's doing its job, but it's spinning out a lot of soot. It's also spinning out a lot of the evidence of problems that you
Mhm.
have. And so one of the great applications that we've seen for this is to be able to do, SEM analysis on spinners. And so there's people that are now doing, routine analysis where they're capturing their filters, either every change, every other change, kind of however often they've deemed that they want to, usually based off of a, some sort of failure mode effect analysis, where they know the timing, how long it normally takes for a failure to exhibit and go to failure. And so they're sending these filters in. We're able to extract, something like spinner cake and run it through an SEM to determine the presence of metals and that sort of thing with the SEM, to identify abnormal copper wear or abnormal bearing wear, that sort of thing.
Interesting. So ultimately, then, what would you recommend to somebody that came up to you and said, what's the best thing I can do to manage my program most effectively?
The best thing that you can do is really, eh, I mean, it's to understand and educate yourself around traditional oil analysis and what its limitations are and how that applies
Mm.
to your equipment. I mean, everybody's equipment's a little bit different, but the equipment is constantly changing. The things
Right.
that we did yesterday are not the same things we're going to do today or that we're going to do tomorrow. And whereas we used to see things like copper and lead, and hey, this is a failure, or hey, this is leaching. As metallurgy changes, applications change, oils change, we're seeing renewed leaching patterns, at different periods of life, and we're seeing failure patterns that we never saw before. We see lead that can sometimes now be leached off of either soldered areas or bearings as well. Whereas historically, hey, if we see some lead, we can dial that in and say, hey, you know what, this is a problem. So really knowing the limitations of routine analysis and understanding what is available out there to help us, because
Mhm.
confirming, and I kind of started it before but probably lost my train of thought. Confirming a problem or the absence of a problem, no
Right.
news is good news. Oftentimes when customers trigger an advanced analysis and pay the extra money, they want to be validated by seeing an issue. But of course, getting the response back that no, this is normal wear, this is bushing wear, or this is just leaching, or the vast majority of leaching. That is just as good news, if not better news, to get
Exactly.
confirmation, because otherwise we don't know, when you're kind of resting at night and you're not quite sure, how the health of those assets are. And so when you start to institute large particle analysis, and you trigger, or even just different analysis that are able to differentiate between these different things like copper leaching or bushing wear or bearing wear. We know that we know as machine owners that you're doing everything that you can to understand the full picture and that there's nothing that's going unmissed.
Mm-hmm. No, I like that. So sometimes no news is good news, right?
Yeah, yeah, it's okay, to have a report back that your assets are healthy, in great condition, and that what you're seeing is completely normal and nothing to worry about. That should be as validating or as a response as, hey, you have abnormal wear that is actionable and you need to go do
Exactly.
something about it. Absolutely.
Fantastic. Well, thank you, Matt. I really appreciate you taking the time today to talk to us on the podcast, and hoped we can chat again another time.
Absolutely. Thank you very much for having me, Kim.